Hi everyone, I'm Chyill and welcome back to another detailed champion guide. Today I'll be talking about Iva, the scavenging inventor, so please sit back, relax and enjoy the show. Iva is a ranged DPS champion who excels in dealing damage at a medium distance with a shotgun and rockets. While Iva is a bit lacking at longer ranges, she can deal a good amount of damage at short to medium distances, and so that's where she will shine best. In terms of control, I think that Iva has some pretty interesting control options, and so I think she's also quite decent in the control department. Since she has a few abilities that can help her avoid or mitigate damage, I'd say she's pretty survivable as well for a ranged champion. After all, she does need to get closer to enemies to actually deal damage as compared to other ranged champions, and so she is more susceptible to taking damage. Overall, while she may need a bit more mechanical skill to make the most out of her abilities, I feel that Iva as a whole is generally pretty straightforward and simple, and so I think she's quite a beginner-friendly champion to play, so long as you get used to hitting one or two of her abilities. So before we start, just like the other champion guides I have made previously for Varesh and Bako, to name a few, I have split this guide up into different sections and I've included timestamps directly to each section in the description below. As usual, feel free to skip ahead to the section that you need if you've already watched the video before. And again, we'll start the guide off with looking at Iva's abilities before talking about her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Then we'll look at the Battlerites options, and finally we finish off with some of my gameplay tips and potential combos when using Iva. And so without further ado, let's begin. First off, let's talk about her abilities one by one. Iva's mouse 1 or left click ability is Boomstick, and this is her basic shotgun attack. What it does is Iva will fire 4 bullets in a cone in front of her, and each of these bullets will deal 4 damage each. There's a spread to the bullets, and so that's why Iva does better against targets that are closer to her, since her bullets are more likely to hit closer targets and hence deal more damage. Iva's shotgun holds up to 2 attacks, and so after every 2 quick attacks, Iva will have to reload for a bit before she can attack again. So yeah, pretty simple ability. The tricky part to this ability is just getting used to the spread of the gun, so that you can maximize the damage you deal at a medium distance, but this will naturally come with practice, so not to worry I suppose. Moving on, Iva's right click or mouse 2 ability is Rocket X67, and this is her long range nuke ability. What it does is that Iva will charge up her rocket for a short while, and then she'll launch it at high speeds in the targeted direction. The rocket will deal a large amount of damage on direct impact, and it will also deal medium damage to enemies around the impact zone. If the rocket reaches its maximum range, it will still explode for some AoE damage, so that's something useful to keep in mind. If the targets have the oil debuff applied on them, I will go through how to apply that debuff onto enemies later in the video. Then they will be inflicted with the burning oil debuff, which is essentially a damage over time effect. The damage from the dot can be quite powerful, so don't disregard it and try to hit your rockets if you know the oil debuff is on the enemy already. So yeah, still pretty simple so far. Next up, Iva's spacebar ability is her main movement ability, Jetpack. What Jetpack does is that Iva will fly toward the targeted location, and while Iva is flying, she will drop oil onto all the enemies below her. The oil debuff reduces the movement speed of enemies inflicted by it by 25%, and the debuff will last for 3.5 seconds. During this time, some of Iva's abilities, like her mouse 2 ability mentioned earlier, can interact with an oil debuff to inflict the burning oil debuff for some good extra damage on the target. The jetpack ability will probably be the main way you apply oil onto enemies with Iva, and it is also your main movement or escape ability, so you will have to properly balance the risk and rewards if you wish to use your spacebar ability offensively for the oil debuff, followed by some way to apply that dot effect. Next up, Iva's Q ability is Zap, and this is a shield ability. What it does is that Iva will remove all negative effects and apply a shield onto a target ally. The shield absorbs up to 28 damage, and it also increases the movement speed of the target by 30%. This shield lasts for 2.5 seconds only, but that's more than enough time to absorb whatever big attack that is thrown your way, and so it's definitely very handy in tight spots, especially when your spacebar ability is on cooldown. Because you can target allies with this shield as well, it is often a good idea to use it to save your ally in need, especially if your team doesn't have a support champion to heal up the damage done by your enemies. Having said that though, do be careful of the 12-second cooldown on this ability. You have to weigh up whether you can afford to be without that shield for 12 seconds when you decide to use that ability, since sometimes you can use it to greater effect if you wait just a little bit longer. Moving on, Iva's E ability is Taser, and this is Iva's main control ability. What it does is that Iva will fire a taser shot at an enemy, and when this shot does successfully hit an enemy, positive effects on the target are removed, and the taser will also interrupt the next ability cast within 0.5 seconds. If the taser manages to successfully interrupt an ability, the target will be stunned for a huge 1.2 seconds, allowing you and your teammates to punish that poor soul for the whole duration. The 1.2 second stun is just enough for you to hit both your M1s onto the target, so you can think of this taser as a 32 damage nuke if you're close enough to the target and you manage to stun them. Very powerful indeed. So those were all of Iva's abilities that doesn't require energy. Now let us move on to those which do. First off, Iva's R ability is Tractor Beam, and this is another one of Iva's control abilities. For 25 energy, Iva can use this ability to channel a beam that will drag enemies toward her position while blocking projectile and melee attacks that come from the front. Enemies within the beam get slowed for 33% while it is channeling, and so this ability is not only quite useful as sort of a channeled frontal shield, but it can also be used to drag enemies away from your teammate or just simply slow enemies down enough so that they can't catch up to your teammate as easily. Quite useful indeed. You just have to be careful of attacks from behind, AoE attacks and AoE stuns while you're channeling this ability, and so if you're stuck in a corner with no outs left available, that 2 seconds of protection from this ability may potentially be a lifesaver if you know that your enemies are out of AoE options and they can't get behind you that easily. So yeah, pretty versatile ability. Moving on, Iva's first EX ability is a shift left click ability, Flamethrower. For 50 energy, Flamethrower can be used to channel a beam of flame in front of Iva, which will deal 50 damage over 2.5 seconds to all targets in front of Iva. Because this attack is a channeling beam type attack, the attack can actually go through barriers and counters, so you don't have to worry about those abilities triggering from your attack. If the enemy has the oil debuff on them, this EX Mouse 1 ability can be a good way of igniting the oil debuff as well, so do take note of that. The bonus damage from the dot effect will be very helpful, and in the ideal scenario, this ability alone could deal 71 damage in total to each enemy caught in the flame for the whole duration. Pretty sweet. Of course, things aren't easy in the proper game, but the potential is there at least. Next up, Iva's second EX ability is a Shift E ability, Concussion Shot. This is Iva's main hard CC ability, and what it does at the cost of 25 energy is that Iva will shoot a shock shell that deals some damage and inflict the incapacitate debuff on the enemy for 3 seconds. Any damage on the enemy will break that debuff, but during that time that the enemy is incapacitated, if it's not removed, Iva can easily land her rockets and mouse 1 hits on the target, while her teammate can also figure out some way of punishing said enemy as well. Otherwise, incapacitating a single enemy and then focusing your attention to the remaining enemy is also a valid tactic, so that's something you could consider as well. So yeah, definitely very useful. Finally, Iva's ultimate ability on the F key is Machine Gun. The ultimate ability is very simple but very powerful, and what it does is that Iva will take out her machine gun to start firing a series of 20 piercing projectiles, which will deal a massive amount of damage to all targets in a line over its channeling duration. A total of 140 damage could be dealt over 2.7 seconds, so that's nothing to scoff at. While channeling, you can still aim with your mouse, and so you will want to get used to aiming with the ultimate ability, especially when the enemies are far away, since the bullets do have some travel time. The ability has a surprisingly long range, and so you can use this to snipe off enemies that are almost dead, but just a bit too far away for your other abilities to kill as well. One thing to note about using this ability though is that Iva is quite vulnerable while channeling, and so you will definitely want to pick up the right time and place to use it, otherwise it'll probably be wasted or you'll be punished for standing still. So yeah, do be careful before using it. Sometimes it might even be better to just use the energy for Iva's other abilities, since the other abilities which require energy are all very good actually. Flamethrower is amazing, her in-cap is amazing, her R can be useful, and so yeah, you don't always need to charge up energy for the ultimate ability. And so that's about it for Iva's abilities. Now let us move on to her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Iva's playstyle would either be a more aggressive type of playstyle or a hang back and poke while waiting for an opportunity kind of playstyle. I think both playstyles are pretty good, and the decision of which playstyle to use will probably depend on what the player is more comfortable doing and the matchup you're facing, I suppose. If you enjoy playing the more laid back playstyle or you're up against multiple ranged enemies, then you will probably just want to hang back a little bit in and wait for a good chance to strike by spamming mouse 2 on cooldown from afar while waiting for opportunities to stun someone with the E ability, or incap someone with the EXE ability, or perhaps just waiting for the melee enemies to jump onto you and make a mistake. Those 3 scenarios are good opportunities for Ivar to take the offensive, and so definitely try to make favourable trades against the target if you can when you're put in that scenarios. To take advantage of these scenarios, it will be pretty good to close the gap a little bit if the enemy is far away and just put in some nice mouse 1 shots. If the enemies have the oil debuff on them, then using EX mouse 1 if you have the energy is a good way of applying lots of pressure as well. If the enemy is nearby and can retaliate, then putting a Q on yourself first before firing your mouse 1 shots would be pretty good as well. So once you've took the chance and did some good damage, and the enemy is starting to recover and can potentially do some damage back to you, then you'll likely want to back away a little bit and try to find the next opportunity to take. You can be saving spacebar for such an exit, or if you know beforehand that you can use Q as an escape, then using spacebar to initially engage upon an enemy when you find a chance is a pretty good move as well. Ivar's mouse 1 attack range isn't very far at all, and so if you're planning to play a more defensive game like I just described, then these will be what you're trying to do pretty much, just rinse and repeat. When playing with a more aggressive playstyle, you'll likely be trying to get closer to enemies, whether by using spacebar or Q to deal as much damage as you can with your mouse 1 attacks. You will likely be using your mouse 1 attacks as much as possible, stopping only to use E or EXE to disrupt the enemies, and EX mouse 1 to make use of the oil debuff on enemies if they have the debuff on them. If you use spacebar to engage, then you'll need to use Q to disengage and vice versa, so be mindful of that. In Ivar's first round of Battlerites, there is a Battlerite which allows her to recast her spacebar. This Battlerite is pretty crucial when you're trying to play Ivar aggressively, and so if you took that Battlerite, you can use hit and run tactics, since you can essentially jump in with spacebar, hit 2 times and jump back out with spacebar again. So that's something to consider. Occasionally, even when playing aggressively, you do need to back away a little bit to wait for your cooldowns to reset and so on, and so when you do this, you'll be aiming to use your mouse tool to poke from afar while waiting for an opportunity to strike again. So yeah, rinse and repeat again pretty much. In both playstyles, when using spacebar to engage, do try to fly over and on top of an enemy if you can to apply the oil debuff, since this will allow you to combo your other abilities with this debuff. During the times when you're not playing aggressively and just hanging back a little bit, then using your EXE, R, or your ultimate ability to help out your teammate are pretty good plays as well. Sometimes, if you're in the heat of things and you have used up all your ults for some reason, then using your R just for that forward facing shield can sometimes be a lifesaver. So that's something to keep in mind as well. On to Ivar's strengths and weaknesses, I think that one of Ivar's strengths is a burst damage output at medium range. With a mouse 1 attack, she can deal 32 damage total in a very short amount of time, and so that's why I think Ivar has some really good burst damage potential. Aside from that, her EX mouse 1 and mouse 2 abilities deal huge amount of damage as well, especially if the target had the oil debuff on them. Enemies at a medium range to Ivar usually cannot keep up with the damage output that Ivar dishes out, and so they will typically lose trades against her at that range. So yeah, pretty strong in that medium range burst, I would say. Moving on, I think that another one of Ivar's strengths is her access to a good mix of damage, support and control abilities. To me, being able to do a little bit of everything is a very good thing because this means that in solo queue scenarios, you can potentially cover for whatever weakness that your team has. If you're lacking a bit of survivability, having access to a shield like Ivar would be pretty good to at least keep your team up a little bit. If you're lacking damage, Ivar can cover a bit of that as long as she plays a little bit more aggressively, and likewise with control, Ivar has access to some hard CC, some interrupts and all that, so she really is kind of like a jack of all trades, which I like. Finally, I think that Ivar is also quite strong in contesting for the AWP. Due to her large burst damage potential, she should be able to secure the AWP for her team fairly easily every time it comes out, and so I think she should definitely try to be in a position to do that every time. Getting the AWP, as you may know, gives lots of benefits to the team that captures it, and so you will want to be able to get it as often as you can. Moving on to her weaknesses, I think Ivar is a little bit weak in terms of sustain. Once she has exhausted her Q ability, Ivar doesn't really have a lot of ways to sustain her health bar, and so in the long run, Ivar loses quite a lot of her ability to really do stuff unless she has a support teammate healing her up. If she doesn't have a support teammate, then all the health globes and the central orbs are really crucial for keeping her health bar up, so that's something to keep in mind, and you should probably try to position her near places with the health orbs. Next up, I think one of Ivar's weaknesses is that she can also be quite easy to predict. As I mentioned, she is a bit of a jack of all trades and she has tools for almost any scenario, but this also has the drawback that she wouldn't have as many options in any one particular situation. For example, she wants to do damage, but her only damaging abilities outside of her ultimate ultimate ability is her Mouse 1, Mouse 2, and EX Mouse 1 abilities. Enemies who identified that Iva is trying to do damage to them will only need to think about one of these three possibilities, and so it becomes really easy to figure out what to do to counter Iva. Not to mention that Iva's Mouse 2 has such a long cast time, so really people just need to figure out whether she's going to attack them with Mouse 1, EX Mouse 1, or do something else like E or not, for example. And finally, I think Iva's biggest weakness is probably her lack of range outside of her Mouse 2 ability. When Iva is up against those slippery long-range enemies, she struggles a little bit against them because she is outranged and doesn't have that many good options to consistently catch up to them for her to deal decent damage to them. Even though Iva can outdamage them in medium distances, it is almost an uphill battle most of the time since they will be almost constantly getting away. Iva will need to use most of her tools just to catch up to them, and so this puts her in a bit of a disadvantage against them at a distance. And so yeah, that's about it for her playstyle, strengths and weaknesses. Now let us move on to Iva's Battlerites options. Once again, you can pause the video to slowly read through every single Battlerites if you wish before I go through my thoughts on her Battlerites, since it will take a long while for me to read it out for you. And so pause now to read them all. Okay, now that you've read all of them, let's continue. In the first tier, I think that it will mostly be a choice between U-turn and Conductor. I think Stockpile is mostly quite useless even in a less aggressive playstyle because the cooldown of the Mouse 2 ability is already quite short. You likely won't have that much time to spend standing still and casting Mouse 2, and so I feel Stockpile is mostly quite worthless. Between U-turn and Conductor, I think the choice would largely depend on how aggressive you want to be. U-turn allows for a lot of aggressive plays, and so definitely pick it if you're looking to be more aggressive with Iva. In fact, even if you're not looking to be that aggressive, it is still a pretty solid all-around pickup since it essentially gives you an extra iframe in the form of the spacebar recast, so it can be quite useful in that situation as well. If you're playing the more laid-back playstyle, Conductor is a pretty big boost to your control potential, especially if your enemies tend to stick together a lot. If the enemy team is both melee or both range, or has a support champion, then you can expect them to be close together at points, so Conductor can get quite some value there. So yeah, pretty straightforward this round. If you're ever in any doubt though, U-turn will probably be the safer overall pickup. Next up, in the second tier, I think that all three Battlerites are all pretty good, and they have their own place. If you're playing the more pokey style of Iva, then Heavy Rocket is certainly a very good pickup. Not only is the snare and bonus damage very helpful against those other long range champions, taking Heavy Rocket also means that you have a very strong combo to take the central orb with. A Mouse 2 followed by 2 Mouse 1s will finish the orb just like that, whereas without the Battlerites, you will be short of 2 damage to take the orb with the same combo. So yeah, pretty solid Battlerites for those situations. Blast Shield is especially useful if you're up against multiple melee enemies. The knockback is useful and the extra haste effect is also very good, so definitely consider it if you're up against multiple melee enemies. If you find it hard to apply oil debuffs when you want to, since it can be quite tricky to apply the oil onto enemies with spacebar, then Oil Blaster could be useful. This also gives you the flexibility when using spacebar as well, since you don't have to fly over the enemy and can fly just somewhere nearby and use Mouse 1 to apply the oil debuff this way. So yeah, 3 different Battlerites for very different scenarios this round, and pick up what you need depending on the matchup I suppose. Moving on, in the third tier are some good options once again. If you picked up U-turn in the first round, then Rocket Boosters offer a lot of value since you get a lot of movement speed boost from those spacebar casts. Couple this with the movement speed boost you get from Chyill, and you get a very dangerous Iva since the movement speed boost really help her to close the gap and deal lots of damage. I particularly like to use spacebar to jump onto an enemy, dropping all over them as I fly, and then when I land, I use my Flamethrower or EX Mouse 1 ability and just run circles around the enemy since I move so fast with this Battlerites. Enemies have no choice but to use their escape abilities since it is hard for them to interrupt your channeling and they will take too much damage if they don't jump away. If they don't have any escapes, then it will be lots of damage coming out from that little combo. Since you probably have U-turn if you pick Rocket Boosters, you can just safely fly away too after doing the little combo. If you find yourself to be in situations where you're trading blows a lot with the enemy, then Hyperspeed can be pretty decent because you typically queue yourself just before you fire a few shots into the enemy. Shooting those Mouse 1s at them faster this way makes it harder for them to dodge it, and you also output more damage in a shorter amount of time, letting you win the trade more easily. If you find that enemies tend to go after your teammate more than yourself, then Tractor Pulse can be a pretty good tool to peel for your teammate. The stun from Tractor Pulse can be quite significant, and so enemies might even waste the cooldown just to get out of that stun. So that's already value right there if they do decide to do that. So yeah, just like in the second round, just pick what you need this round depending on the way the enemies plays I suppose. In the 4th tier, I think it will mostly be a choice between Durable Shield and Gunge. Electrocution has some nice bonus damage for Ivar's E ability, but typically you use the E ability just for the stuns, or just as an interrupt, and so you wouldn't really need that 8 bonus damage. I feel the extra shields you get from Durable Shield offers more to you and your team than the 8 bonus damage you sometimes get from using the E on the enemy. But I guess if you took the Battlerites which lets your E jump, then maybe this might be worth it. So yeah, that's why I say it is mostly a choice between Durable Shield and Gunge. Against some of these agile champions, Gunge will be useful in slowing them down a bit more, hence saving you or your teammates some much needed health, or making it that much easier for you to deal damage to them. If you picked up Oil Blaster in the second round, then Gunge becomes even more attractive of a pick as well, since you're more likely to be able to apply oil onto targets. If you're only looking for survivability, then I think Durable Shield will be the better pick compared to Gunge overall. So yeah, when in doubt this round, just pick Durable Shield unless you need the other two Battlerites for a certain reason. Finally, in the 5th and final tier, I think it will most likely be stability that you want. All systems operational does a lot of things, but I think the shield that you get from stability will probably be more helpful overall, since you will be targeted somehow while casting the ultimate ability. The enemies typically won't just let you stand there and cast your ultimate on them non-stop, so you will expect some form of resistance. That 30 health shield is just too good to pass up for some extra damage that probably won't go off either way, since enemies will probably interrupt or stun you. So yeah, stability is way better. So that's about it on Ivar's Battlerites. Now let's move on to some of my gameplay tips for playing Ivar, as well as some potential combos with her. My first tip for playing Ivar is to think a little bit more about when to engage and when not to. Because she is more effective at a short to medium distance, she functions a little bit more like a melee champion, and so you will need to think a little bit about how you want to engage with her, when and where is a good time and place to engage, and so on. This is quite important, more so when you don't have a support champion, since Ivar doesn't really have any real self-sustain at all. Mistakes will lead to you losing too much health and then struggle to stabilize again. So yeah, try to pick your fights carefully so that you do not lose too much health. Next up, another tip I have for playing Ivar is to think of yourself as a disruptor of sorts. While Ivar is not Bako, she can still play a sort of disruptor role, especially when she's teamed up with teammates who do better when not being under pressure. Ivar has a few ways to really be quite disruptive to the enemy. Her E, Shift E, R and Q abilities are all very good at disrupting the enemy's flow and tempo, and so I think she can be very good at doing that job. Also, using these abilities, she can very effectively peel for a teammate while dealing good damage to the enemies as well, and since it is often frustrating to play against a disruptive opponent, playing this way doubles as a way to make enemies lose focus from the game as well, so I think that's pretty sweet. Moving on, another tip I have for playing Ivar would be to play her as you would a very control-oriented champion as well. I find that most of the time, my damage comes from my mouse 1 attacks or mouse 2 attacks that I shoot right after stunning someone with my E ability. And so most of the time, more of my attention is put on trying to find opportunities to interrupt and stun people with my E ability, just so that it opens up this possibility of dealing lots of burst damage onto them. So yeah, 2 birds with 1 stone, basically disrupting them and dealing lots of damage to them at the same time. Onto some team compositions. I think that Ivar goes well with support champions, melee champions, as well as champions who do well when they're not under pressure. That actually seems like it's almost every champion, and I think it is quite possible to a certain extent that that is the case, since Ivar is a jack of all trades as I said. And so it does make a bit of sense if she can fit with almost any champion quite nicely. Since that information isn't particularly helpful, my personal preference would actually be to pair up Ivar with a support champion, since I think that Ivar doesn't really like damage, and she really benefits a lot from health she gains from heals. If I were to pick a non-support teammate, then I think I quite like having melee teammates as Ivar, since they can take some pressure off of Ivar, and in turn you can support the melee teammate with all sorts of control abilities, shields and so on. Furthermore, if you really need to do it because of team compositions or whatever, you can also try to play extra aggressively together with the melee teammate and try to rush down a single opponent. So yeah, those are just my personal preference and how I like to play Ivar. Overall, I think that Ivar is a ton of fun to play. I always enjoy jack of all trade champions in whatever game really, mostly because I like to have something for every situation and scenario. Ivar fits that role perfectly, as you can imagine by now, and so I think if you're that kind of player, then definitely give Ivar a try. While it might take a while to get used to hitting some of her abilities properly, since their cast times are quite different from one another, I think she's fairly simple to understand and play, and you will be able to pick her up after a few matches with her. And so yeah, that's about it for my Ivar guide. I hope you found it useful. As you may know, Ivar is the last Battlerites champion in the current roster that I haven't made a guide on yet, and so that means I have now made a guide for all the current champions in the game. While I know I would definitely go back and update some of my outdated champion guides at some point in the future, since I am on holiday for a while now, I will probably take a short break from making these champion guides for a bit and try exploring some other types of videos and perhaps some other games as well that may be interesting. I will still try my best to make 2 videos a week, but that's only if I can manage it while on holiday. Once I get back from holiday, then I'll go back to my normal schedule. So yeah, in the meantime, I hope you enjoy the other videos I put out as well, and I look forward to showing you guys some other cool stuff as well. With all that said, even with the crappy audio quality, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe to the channel, like it, comment on it, share this video, and you can check out my other videos as well if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching my video, and until next time guys, have a great day, keep gaming, stay chill, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.